So in this clip we'll present a simple textbook theory of national money markets, national financial markets, and we will see how that determines the interest rate and how monetary policy works in a very simple textbook version. So let me put that up here, the money market, and one, the determination of the interest rate, and second, monetary policy, which of course will be geared towards changing the interest rate. So let me clear the page here and begin with a couple of assumptions. First, we have two assets, namely money and bonds. Money is assumed to not pay a return, so holding cash gives you no return except for the security that it provides in being available for making transactions. The bonds, on the other hand, pay a rate of return, but are not risk-free. So these are risky assets versus the risk-free asset, or liquid assets versus relatively illiquid assets. So we have these two assets, and we have two agents, or two types of agents. That's one, the central bank, and two, the private sector financial market participants. And these two interact. So the central bank, as you'll see, determines the money supply, which is a somewhat outdated assumption. In reality, the central bank rather targets the interest rate, but we can go with this textbook version since it is a good first approximation. And the private sector participants determine money demand. And obviously, as in any market here, when supply is equal to demand, then we have an equilibrium, and this equilibrium will give us the interest rate. So the interest rate is the variable that clears money supply and money demand. The interest rate is the variable that brings the financial market into equilibrium. Let's go to a new page and look at money supply and money demand in a little more detail. So first of all, M over P is the real money balances, indexed here with an S. That's money supply. Money supply is exogenous, set by the central bank. And second, money demand is the M over P D. And now the question is, what is money demand? Money demand is a function of income and the interest rate. So principally, these two arguments determine what the real money demand is, with a positive sign on income and a negative sign on the interest rate, so that simply the higher the real income, the higher are the cash needs in order to conduct transactions, and on the other hand, the higher the interest rates, the higher is the demand for bonds, so that the lower will be the demand for real money. So essentially, if you can make a higher profit with the risky asset, you will shift your wealth towards that and demand less money. On the other hand, the lower the interest rate, the more difficult, the more unreasonable it seems to give up the comfort of having cash in hand for the little bit of return that you get for holding the risky asset. We can put that into a diagram with the interest rate on this axis, real money balances on this axis, and then we have the two curves. Well, money supply is exogenous, so here as a straight line independent of the interest rate, and you see here y is exogenous to this diagram, but the interest rate is not, so we can draw this line as a downward sloping function of the interest rate. Here's the money demand function, and we get at the intersection here, let's highlight it as well, at the intersection we get R star, which would be the equilibrium interest rate that clears the financial markets. Now let's consider a couple of changes in exogenous variables, and that will get us as well to monetary policy. I will just redraw the diagram, and we'll get our equilibrium here. So the question now is, what if we have a rise in real income? What is the impact of a rise in real income? We know that this is LYR and M over P is, so we said that the demand for money changes with the same sign as the change in income, so that partial is positive. Since y is exogenous in this diagram, we get a rightward shift of this curve. So we get a rightward shift here, and we have Ly2R, where y2 is larger than y1, the original income. So what has happened here? Now, if in this situation you see real income has increased, and people have higher cash needs in order to conduct transactions, so they're trying to get their hands on more cash. There's only one way you can do that. You have to sell part of your bonds. So you try to shift your portfolio from maybe being heavy in bonds to being heavier in cash, because you have those cash needs. Now what happens if everybody's doing that? Well, you get downward pressure on bond prices, and the price of bonds is inversely related to the interest rate. So as you're getting downward pressure on bonds, the interest rate rises, and we're getting this increase in R. So here's R star 1 and here's R star 2. Now we can do a similar thought experiment and consider monetary policy. Let's draw a diagram. Money supply, and money demand. What if the central bank wants to reduce the interest rate? Well, it's quite straightforward to see that requires an increase in the money supply, which will lead us to a new R star 1 and R star 2. So we have, with the increase in the money supply here, we get a reduction in the interest rate. What has happened? Well, we said we have these two actors here, the central bank and the private sector PS. The central bank increases the money supply by buying bonds. So central bank goes out and buys bond from the owners of the bonds, the holders of the bonds, which are the private sector market participants. And as the central bank is buying these bonds, their price increases, which again, because of that inverse relationship between the price of bonds and the interest rate, leads to a reduction in the interest rate. So essentially, the central bank acting as a large participant in the bond market leads to a change in the price of bonds, a change in the yield on the bonds, and at the same time to this increase in the money supply. You can of course make the same argument in the reverse direction. So you have MPS here and MPD here, so that a reduction in the money supply implies this rise in interest rate. Again, what has happened here? Well, the central bank now goes out and sells bonds. So as the central bank sells bonds, the price falls and the yield on the bond rises. But as the central bank sells bonds, it mops up cash that has previously been in private sector hands and reduces liquidity. So let me put that here, maybe CB buys bonds and CB sells bonds. In any of these cases, the key issue is that this simple domestic or national financial market with two assets gives us a clear explanation what determines the interest rate, which is private sector return seeking or security seeking behavior on the one hand, and monetary policy on the other, conducted by the central bank.